You're tuned into Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick, and this is episode 75, Eliakim, Peter, and the Papacy, with Suan, Sonna. And before we jump into tonight's episode, guys, just a reminder, Havana Palace on Huron Church Road in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Best service, finest cigars. Go see Caesar and Eli. They treat all their customers like family. So if you'd be so kind as to go to facebook.com/Havana Palace and give their page a like, I would greatly appreciate it. So I have with me back again for, I don't know if it's the third or fourth time, but it's always a pleasure. Swan, how are you doing this evening, my friend?
Oh, Dustin, I'm great talking to you.
Well, you always bless me and you bless the viewers. So we're going to do nothing short of that tonight. You recently put out an expose on your channel, Intellectual Conservatism, the new Eliakim Typological Argument for the Papacy. Now, that's a mouthful. And I can't believe I remembered it without looking at it. 4 hours. It was an absolute powerhouse of a presentation. And, you know, the first thing that comes to mind, well, one of them anyway, is everybody's looking for the authentic, Hebrew roots Christianity. Well, you can't get any more Jewish than the topic that we're about to talk about tonight. And that is the Old Testament roots of the papacy. So we're going to try to unpack and maybe answer some objections to this argument in about 40 minutes max.
Yeah.
So what can you tell us about the person of Eliakim, and what does the person of Eliakim tell us about a special office held in ancient Israel in the kingdom of Judah?
Yes. So Eliakim appears to have been under King Hezekiah about 700 BC or so, and the basic context in which we first see Eliakim appear is Isaiah 22. And so in this context, Shebna has been deposed from his office as chief steward. And from what we can tell, Shebna's sin was apparently he tried to, carve out a burial site for himself in a place where, I believe it's kings and other great people were buried. And so Shebna was kind of being presumptuous in believing that, he was going to be this great worthy person. And then God, obviously, through the prophet Isaiah, is saying, he did not approve of this. And so Shebna gets torn down from his office. And then when we build up to verses 22 to 25, beginning actually maybe in verse 18 to 25, we start seeing this figure Eliakim rise up, and God says eventually in verse 22, I'll give you the keys of the house of David. Whatever you open, none shall shut. Whatever you shut, none shall open. So from what we can tell, Eliakim was probably the high point of the office of chief steward in ancient Israel. Some other people who held this office were probably, for example, Jotham under I'm trying to remember if it's Azra or which king it was, or Obadiah. I forget which one, but Jotham was the son of the king. The king eventually becomes stricken with leprosy, and then he takes over. And it says, I believe in 2 Kings, that he was the one over the house or over the palace. And so that describes the office. Now, for Eliakim himself, the precursor for his office, this is some speculation. I think it's reasonable, though. There's all kinds of nuances we can get into, but basically the argument seems to be that the language that's used for Eliakim in Isaiah 22 seems to be allusions back to Joseph's office under Pharaoh. Right, so, for example, like Joseph was also called the father over Egypt. And then Eliakim is also called, I think in verse 21, the father of the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. Right. So obviously similar terminology. Pharaoh also puts Joseph over his house, or makes him the overseer of his household. Yeah. And then obviously Eliakim in Isaiah and in 2 Kings is described as over the house constantly. So these are kind of the ways in which we could conceive of Eliakim's office as being almost like the right-hand man of the king. And he represents almost the high point of this office.
Interesting. So this was an office in the Davidic monarchy. Now, one might be tempted to think that this is merely an administrative, secular, if we can use that term, role. But is there any indication that this might have some sacral type of connotations as well? Anything maybe priestly, not just administrative? Is there any cues that would like lend credence to that idea?
Yeah, Dustin, there's just so much evidence. I was kind of surprised the more I investigated because I knew, for example, there was the tunic and the girdle or the robe and the sash. It depends on your translation of, the Old Testament there. But
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, so I looked into Timothy Rucker's work on the temple keys of Isaiah 22:22. Rucker wrote a book for More Seebeck. He's an academic publisher. And in this book, he investigates, the key of the house of David and how it's used throughout, Matthew 16:19 and even Revelation 3:7. And
Right.
Rucker basically makes the argument that Eliakim was also in a way connected to the temple in some
Okay.
way. So for example, the tunic and the girdle. We know that the tunic was something worn by priests, obviously, and then the girdle is always used, I believe, to refer to a garb that the priest would wear. And then what we see is that only priests are ever described as having both the tunic and the girdle. And Eliakim in Isaiah 22 has both the tunic and the girdle. Some other things to
Mm.
keep in mind too is that I think in verse 18 it mentions that he's to wear some type of I forget what it's called, but like a kind of vestment or garb of sorts, to a shawl, if you will. And then it's like,
Okay.
okay, well, that's even more priestly imagery, right? And then Rucker goes even into more detail. For instance, I think Rucker argues that the peg that's referred to, or the nail that is referred to describe Eliakim's office, might be an allusion to the nails that held onto the temple or the tent. So I mean,
Mm.
there's all kinds of other ways in which images are used in Isaiah 22 to heavily imply a priestly aspect to Eliakim's office. The other thing I should
Yeah.
mention too is just in the earliest kind of Jewish, so in the Jewish reception of Isaiah 22, um, there's almost near unanimity that Eliakim was some kind of priest. So the Septuagint, I believe, calls him a high priest. The
Mhm.
Targum, the Aramaic translation of the Old Testament, says that he has the key of the house of David and the sanctuary. And then it
Right.
adds in later that the descendants of Eliakim will wear the ephod and be priests. So,
Interesting.
I mean, regardless, even
Mhm.
in Jewish thought, there was this idea that he was some kind of priestly figure. And I know that, Gavin Ortland has made the argument that Eliakim is not a priestly figure, but I just don't think that's a sustainable argument anymore in light of just all the research that's been done. And I would encourage anybody who's skeptical of what I've just said, look into Rucker's work, look into the work of other scholars like I think Patrick Barber, if I remember properly,
Oh, Michael
wrote
Barber.
Michael Barber, yeah, wrote a paper about
Mhm.
Jesus rebuilding the Davidic temple and Peter's priestly role. So, I mean, I think there's just so much evidence now that there was something priestly about Eliakim's office. Now, I will say
Mhm.
though that I think Gavin's response was to cite I think Exodus 28 when it describes the garments of the high priest. Now, as you know, Dustin, priests wore different kinds of garments. The high priest had his own distinct wear, but of
Yeah.
course, there were also other priests who had different, garments as well. Not everybody wore the same thing that the high priest wore, obviously.
Right.
So I think that there, especially since it's talking about Aaron and it mentions the descendants of Aaron, what they will wear, that's referring to the high priestly garbs. But in terms of the tunic and the girdle, that is something only said of priests.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's one thing I was, and another thing in the Targums, doesn't it mention a turban?
Yeah, the turban. I think that's what I meant by in verse 18. The
Mhm.
turban is what it's described as him wearing as well. Dustin, I should also just quickly say that in ancient Israel, as you know, Dustin, there was not a neat distinction between church and state. So
Mhm.
that's the other problem, too. I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, David acted as a priest. And even I'd say it goes back to Saul because Saul is described as using, it appears to be the Urim and the Thummim in Second Samuel, which is
Mhm.
something only the high priest could use. So already then we have the melding of the king with the religious cult. And by cult, I don't
Yeah.
mean like in a negative way,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
like the ceremony of the people. Mhm.
Yeah. So, um, the idea that, well, he might have worn priestly garments as sort of just a ceremonial badge of honor,
Hmm.
I don't think that would hold much weight because there's no precedent in ancient Israel for just, I don't, how do I put this without being too crass? Dressing up, but
Hmm.
not having the substance of the office. I don't think that argument holds too much weight when you consider all the data and all the evidence.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The balance of the probability, I think, is in favor of Eliakim being some kind of priestly figure. I mean, even in the recent research that I've looked at, like for instance, Rucker cites a doctoral dissertation from the Catholic University of America. I should also mention that Rucker himself is a Baptist. He's not a Catholic.
Okay.
Right. So and also people who go to Catholic University of America, they're not all Catholic. Right. So that's another thing to point out. So I don't know what, I think the scholar's name is Prakasama or something like that. I don't know what his background is, but he even says something like, based on just the arguments that I've just given, but of course not from my mouth, but from other people, that Eliakim must have somehow been over the temple and served as this prime minister figure at the same time, simultaneously.
Yeah, as I mentioned to you in the message there the other night, I mean, it's just interesting because the Davidic kings themselves were priests after the order of Melchizedek. So you would think that the one who is second only to the king would also inherit this priesthood by participation if he's standing in for the king and invested with his authority, his jurisdiction.
You know, Dustin, and I mean, you know, if the tunic and the girdle, right, that combination is only said of priests, right, in every single case. And now the question is, let's say we have this one case where it seems like this guy has the tunic and the girdle, and we know that it's only used in combination for priests. Should we say, the balance of the probability seems to be that this guy might be priestly? Or should we say the balance of the probability is, oh, this is an entirely different use, it's only for ceremonial clothing? It's like, no, I mean, we can't go with the latter. The former seems to be the best balance of the probability. And you just made this argument about the king being, you know, in a priest, right, in the order of Melchizedek. And so it's like, yeah, already then even the secular civil offices in the government, the king, for crying out loud, is also a priest of sorts. So, you know, for me, it just goes all the way down then at that point.
Right. So when, you know, a lot of Catholic apologists, obviously, when they talk about Matthew 16 and Peter's commission, they say, well, the background to this is Isaiah 22, and Eliakim and Peter are connected. Obviously, this is what Jesus is alluding to, and his audience would have understood. So what would you say are some of the connections between Eliakim's office and Peter's call and Peter's office?
Yeah, so I'll just present kind of the argument that I gave in the 4-hour stream that I did the other day.
Right.
So basically, the argument is divided into 3 phases. The first phase is just there to establish that there is a textual allusion between Isaiah 22:22 and Matthew 16:19. Now, some people will say, oh, there's intertextuality, but I don't know if I'd say it's an allusion. Now, the problem with that argument is that, as G.K. Beale points out in the handbook on the New Testament use of the Old, intertextuality was a term invented by postmodern theory. Okay. And, you know, even within that framework, it's not a very useful term. And I think Beale's, you know, he's pretty clear on this. And Beale says, okay, so even if we say it's intertextuality, right, we would have to say it's like interbiblical, or, you know, textuality, or intertextual allusion, or even, you know, in literary thought, there's this idea of there being coincidental intertextuality and obligatory intertextuality. And so what I'm arguing then, even if you want to use the term intertextuality, is this is an obligatory intertextual allusion. It's not an accident. It's not a coincidence that Matthew is doing this, right?
Right.
And so what I do is I use the standards of scholars to find a textual allusion. So I use Richard Hayes's work. And even though, so Richard Hayes, he mainly works in the area of Pauline scholarship, but his arguments have been used by scholars throughout the board to identify textual allusions in other areas, right? So I use the standard methodology, and I show that, yes, the Isaiah-Matthew parallel is certainly there. So, for example, in the Nestle Aland Novum Testamentum Graeci, the 28th edition, this is the Greek translation of the New Testament, you know, in the left margins, it shows where the scholars in I think it's the Institute for New Testament Studies, or New Testament Textual Studies, they looked and they try to see in the left-hand margin, they'll write where they think an allusion occurs. And right next to Matthew 16:19, they put Isaiah 22:22.
Right. Okay.
And so it's like it has a scholarly gold stamp of approval.
Yes.
All right. So then the second phase of the argument is to show that there is a new Eliakim typology based on the person of Peter, right? There are all kinds of ways that I aim to show this. Like I try to show, for example, that alternate explanations of, for instance, Matthew's engaging in a Jesus Eliakim typology in Matthew 16:19 doesn't work. or some arguments where it's just like, oh, the only thing being played on are the keys and not Peter or not anybody, right? I show that that explanation doesn't work either. And therefore, the best explanation seems to be the Peter Eliakim typology. Even given, for example, like when you look at the Old Testament, right? It's God giving the keys of a kingdom to a man. And with those keys come a definitive exercise of authority that is contrastive, right? So God in the Old Testament, he, in the future tense, will give keys, the key of the house of David to Eliakim. And Eliakim uses that authority to open and shut in a definitive manner. And they're both contrastive, open, shut. Peter, bind, loose, definitive matter in heaven, And then we see, God in the New Testament speaking in the first person again, in the future tense, I will give the keys of the kingdom of heaven, right? And what's fascinating is, I looked at 2 Samuel 7, and I think it's somewhere in First Chronicles where the same Davidic, the same prophecy of the Davidic covenant is given. And in 2 Samuel 7, it says, I will establish, your house and your kingdom, talking to David. And then in First Chronicles, it says, I will establish my house and my kingdom. God is speaking in the first person. And so what God is saying with these two different versions of the covenant, or they might have been given on separate occasions, I need to look at the context again. God's saying David's kingdom is my kingdom, right? And so because, Jesus mentions the kingdom of heaven in the New Testament, that doesn't mean that is not also implying the Davidic kingdom as well. And I even show in Jewish thought how when they mentioned, the kingdom of heaven, or excuse me, the kingdom of David, the Jews would also say, don't forget to mention, it's appropriate to mention the kingship of God.
Interesting. So what about binding and loosing? I mean, I've heard various things, it's the power to forgive sins. It's the power to make halakhic decisions and rulings. I've actually heard an interesting argument from a Protestant scholar that I've not heard before. And they say, based on Second Temple usage, binding and loosing refers to the power of exorcism.
Yep.
And he's speaking contra the Catholic position. So he's saying all it is the power of exorcism. But I don't see that. I don't know how valid that would be.
Are you talking about Richard Here's paper? What is it? The binding and loosing the Matthean authorizations.
This is actually from Michael Heiser.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'm sure Heiser got that from Here's, because Here's in the scholarly literature is the one who kind of is known for making that argument.
Okay.
So, I looked at, and, I gave a presentation on this a while back, but basically I think it was on Catholic Answers. And my basic point is that, I think there might be some validity to the idea of binding and, okay, well, here's the problem, right? With some of the texts that are proposed for justifying this exorcism interpretation, like the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs and other texts, what usually happens is only the word bind is used.
Oh, okay.
And not usually the word loose.
Right.
And so what they're doing is they're going with the one word bind and then trying to figure out the meaning. And I'm like, okay, well, that kind of already seems a little bit sketchy, right? Like you want both being used.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, for example, like if I said break a leg, right? And then let's say you tried to understand what I meant by looking at the word break. Or for example, if I say this is an open and shut case and you only looked at the word case. Open, right? Yeah. It's like you need to look at usages that have the whole thing involved. So for example, this is why I think Josephus's work is the best referent. So in War of the Jews, book 1, chapter 5, I think paragraph 2, Josephus talks about the authority of the Pharisees under Queen Alexandra in about 76 BC. And Josephus describes how the Pharisees had the power to bind and loose men as they pleased, right? So binding and loosing referred to the public administrative authority of the Pharisees to judge people. Now, William Whiston, in his translation of Josephus, has tried to argue that, oh, well, then it just means bind and loose people. It doesn't mean bind and loose things or, actions or decisions. But the problem with Whiston's interpretation of that is this. So, for example, when the Supreme Court made the decision on DC v. Heller, right, this decision obviously was the court adjudicating between two persons. But all of us know that the Heller decision was also about the Second Amendment and gun rights. And so it can simultaneously be about a person and actions. I mean, Dustin, have you ever seen a judge adjudicate a case between people and it didn't have ramifications for actions,
Of
right?
course
Like,
not.
like if I put my, I don't know, my fence in my neighbor's lawn, and the judge, let's say, sides with me, they don't just side with me, they're also siding with the action that I did,
Yeah.
right? And they're so, I mean, I think the best reference that's most contemporaneous to the Gospel of Matthew, if you take the view that the Gospel of Matthew was written maybe 80 AD, and then Josephus wrote War of the Jews 75 AD, that's the best reference for binding and loosing.
Yeah. And exorcism could well be part of that. I
Yeah.
mean, especially given that it's a priestly office. So there'd
Yes.
be, priestly functions, and exorcism would be one of them. So, but I think the problem is sometimes people make these things zero-sum games, and they make false dichotomies when, the infamous Catholic both and comes into play, where it's multifaceted, it's
Yeah.
multivalent, it's participatory, it's not a zero-sum game. And that's, the same thing I would say to somebody who says, well, Jesus has the key of David in Revelation, so Peter can't have the keys. Well, no, Jesus has the key in the strict sense, but he can also delegate this, right? So there's no either or here.
Yeah, and even D.A. Carson in the Expositor's Bible Commentary, I always mention this because it's such a great quote. But when he's defending, for instance, Matthew 16:18 and the argument that Peter is the rock, when he defends this position, he responds to the Protestant objection. Oh, well, Christ is the cornerstone. Or no, the Bible elsewhere says that the apostles are the foundation and the prophets, right? And then Carson says you have to interpret images within their immediate context. So in the context of Matthew's gospel, Peter's the rock. In the context of Matthew's gospel, he actually says this explicitly. Peter has the keys. In Revelation 3:7, Christ has the keys. It's not a zero-sum game, as you pointed out. I mean, one other thing I'll just point out really quick about binding and loosing is that, when you look at other texts like Mishnah Pesachim 4:5, what you see is that the way in which binding and loosing is used is almost kept consonant within Jewish thought from the time of Jesus and Josephus onwards. So, for example, they'll say like what the school of Hillel binds, the school of Shammai looses. Even up to the Babylonian Talmud, it says what with one sage binds, the other should not loose. Like it will use this terminology pretty consonantly, or constantly. I think I had one more point that I wanted to mention there. Maybe that's. Oh well, I think so. I think the best actually example for the exorcism interpretation, because I do want to say that I think judicial language is being used to refer to the ministry of exorcism, and this might be maybe a vestige of Second Temple thought, or
Right.
earlier Second Temple thought, I should say, because we're still in the Second Temple period for the New Testament.
Right.
Like I think it's Luke chapter 15 when it deals with the woman who had, was I think internally bleeding, or was the woman with the bent back? I forgot which one it was. And Jesus says, why is it that you're saying that on the Sabbath I can't loose this woman of her, bondage to Satan or something like that?
Yeah.
Why can't I loose her of this restraint? And so there it's like, okay, I think you do see the words like bind and loose there in the Greek, or at least variations of them that are close enough. And it's like, okay, well, that's interesting, because when Jesus talks about this restraint that's on the woman, in the previous verse, Jesus actually engages in a halakhic dispute with the sages, with the rabbis there. And so the restraint there could actually have a double meaning, both for being the power of Satan and the power of the sages to bind her on this day and prevent her from having a miracle.
Yeah. So it all can be worked in together.
Yeah.
Not mutually exclusive at all.
Right.
So one thing I quickly wanted to bring up, and I'm glad that you mentioned this in your presentation. So we always say, well, the early church used the Septuagint, and when you go to the Septuagint, and I've seen our Orthodox brothers and sisters use this argument, it doesn't say key of the house of David; it says the glory of David.
Right.
And this is just found in the Masoretic text, but that's not entirely true. As you point out, there are some manuscript recensions in the Septuagint that do have key.
Yes.
So it's not an open and shut case, pardon the pun, but yeah. So it is found in the Septuagint as well, just probably not the oldest manuscript traditions. Correct?
Yeah. I mean, and so this means maybe that the key of David was not in the Greek, in the Septuagint, maybe during the time of Jesus, but it later is added in, perhaps. And the church fathers who had the later edition might have been more able to see, the illusion. So, for example, Theodoret of Cyrus, I used him as an example of probably the earliest church father that we have to note the illusion. And I believe he's in the 5th century, in the 400s, 300s into the 400s.
Yeah.
Theodoret was a bishop of Antioch. And, he's a controversial figure for all kinds of reasons. But the main thing is that he was one of the principal patristic commentators on the book of Isaiah. And so, it's important that we have him. And in his commentary on Isaiah, he appears to have had the later edition of the Septuagint, right? I think it's the one that's found, I think it's Codex Vaticanus, that version that has, and it's interesting because the edition, the expanded edition of the Septuagint, it says, I'll give him, was it the key of the glory of the house of David, and none shall contradict him. And then it adds in, I'll give him the key of the house of David, and whatever he opens, none shall shut, whatever. It adds all that together in a kind of sandwich. So anyway, it seems like Theodoret had that later version, because he notes in his commentary on Isaiah that the church, that there's a typological relationship between Matthew 16:19 and Isaiah 22, but he uses it to refer to our status as the church, that we were he says prototypified or prototyped, or just basically, prefigured. So he's using typological language here for the relationship between 16:19 and Isaiah 22:22.
Interesting. So Theodoret of Cyrus?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, because I was going to ask you about any patristic references to that typological illusion. So he's a big one.
Yeah.
Okay, so a couple things, because I don't want to run over our 40 minutes here. We're coming up on 27, so I want to make sure we just kind of gloss everything as much as we can. So, what does the office of Eliakim tell us about the papacy? I mean, what about this office being supreme and having immediate and universal jurisdiction, to use Vatican I's language?
Yeah, and I should mention too, I don't know if I forgot this, but that was the third phase of the argument that I gave. Phase 1, textual illusion. Phase 2, Peter Eliakim typology. Phase 3, showing that this typology it sets up the papacy quite well. Like, it's what we would expect precisely if the papacy were true. So the office of Eliakim, from what we can tell, it was absolute in terms of being second to the king, right? Whatever you open, none shall shut. Whatever you shut, none shall open, right? I mean, and it's interesting because when we look at Eliakim in scripture, he has to, so when Eliakim, and I believe it's Joel, or this other figure, the three of them approach the Assyrians as they try to negotiate, with the Assyrians to prevent them from sacking Jerusalem. And every single time it's mentioned, Eliakim is always first on the list. And Eliakim also is always mentioned with his title, Master of the Palace. And then, Shebna is the secretary or the scribe. And then Joel's the secretary. So you see, what's interesting with this passage is that Hezekiah's master of the army, or commander of the army, would actually ordinarily have been the one to do these negotiations with a military power, but somehow Eliakim is allowed to come in and do this. And so it seems as if Eliakim was actually able to take over other offices, and his authority was basically whatever the king needed him to do. So technically speaking, even in the administration, his jurisdiction was unlimited. And we also know, based on the surrounding nations, the Syrians and the Babylonians and others, that they had a similar office of chief steward under their kings. And that this office of chief steward had the capacity to, it was the highest administrative position that you could possibly have. And then just some other things that we can point out. So, for example, Jotham, as I mentioned, I think before, was able to rule as the king while his father was incapacitated. We also see, throughout the Old Testament, that the office is always generally referred to as being, over the palace, the one who has the access to the king. But I should also mention, in the case of going back to Isaiah 22, that when it talks about Eliakim being the father of the inhabitants of Jerusalem and over the house of Judah, during this time, Israel and Judah were divided.
Right.
And the side that was Israel was obviously, under foreign occupation, I believe, by the Assyrians or the Babylonians, either one. And whatever remained of Israel was technically under, right, Eliakim's jurisdiction. And so we can say, even despite this nuance, that, yeah, he did have universal jurisdiction, right? So, I mean, I think these are all ways in which you can show that his power was virtually unlimited. It was whatever was necessary for the king, what was ever necessary for the life of the kingdom. We see that this office could rule in the place of the king if it should be necessary. He was like the king's right-hand man. And then also we see this office was the highest administrative position, and it had universal jurisdiction over Israel.
And it was a successive office too, right?
Yes, it was a successional office. I think the first prime minister that is mentioned is Ahishar, if I recall properly, under King Solomon. So the sons of David, all of them had this office of chief steward or master of the palace.
Yeah, it's just interesting when you look at the Pope today. He's the head official of Vatican City State, so he's got that aspect, but he's also a high priest.
Yeah,
and he has authority over the vessels, right? Just like Eliakim.
Yes,
he wears the sacred vestments.
Yes, the authority over the vessels. That's been another argument for possibly Eliakim being a priest, because that was only generally something said of, priests over the vessels that they had.
Right, exactly. So much for just having mere ceremonial garb. I mean, you have control over the sacred vessels of the temple. That's saying something quite substantially priestly there. And it's also interesting too when you look at the book of Daniel, how it mentions when all the other nations fall, the kingdom of God at the end of days will be established in Rome, which is interesting as a prophecy.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Was it the fourth beast, right?
The fourth beast,
defeated.
Yeah. Exactly. So with our remaining time, we got about 8 minutes. Why don't we talk about so what are some of the best objections? So we don't want to straw man people. We want to steel man them, right? So what are some of the best objections and responses to this typological argument for the papacy that you've encountered thus far?
So the best would be perhaps, of the people who've interacted with me, like Gavin Wortland has his typology run amok objection. Okay. And so his argument's basically like there's arbitrariness in what I'm picking and choosing transfers over from Eliakim's office and what doesn't. And there's two responses that one can give. The first is that I think we have reasonable principles for deciding what doesn't transfer over. So, for example, Jesus is a son of David. He is a king, and he is a king in the fullest sense that we can imagine. Oh, well, if Jesus is a Davidic king, then where's his armies? Where's his power of taxation?
Yeah,
where's and where's his queen? Well, we know where his queen is.
We know where his queen is,
right? Yeah. But where his his just all these things that you can just add in and try to throw. And it's like, well, no, like we can say that first Jesus, maybe we can say that Jesus doesn't have these kind of war powers in a secular sense of assembling an army, right? Because that's not the kind of king that he is, as explained in I think John 18:36, where he says, "My kingdom is not of this world." In the sense of kind of being a violent revolt to overturn governments, right, and establish a parallel kingdom. That's not what it is. And so somebody might say, "Oh, you're just picking and choosing. This is a Davidic king messiah. Your Jesus Davidic king typology run amok." It's like, no. Like basically, what we're doing, Dustin, is the same thing that anybody who has to deal with the question of continuity and discontinuity between the Old and New Testament has to do. And I think we can reasonably establish, for instance, there's the question that Gavin raised about whether or not this office is biologically hereditary, right? Why doesn't that transfer over? Yeah. Well, one is that I think I've seen some scholars question if this office is actually biologically hereditary. So I don't know if that's really a starter, at all. But even if it is, we know in the New Testament that the idea of family is expanded immensely. So Jesus talks about those who do the will of God are my mother and my brothers and sisters, so there's a sense in which the kingdom of God has been expanded beyond just blood and family and ethnicity to now include everyone who partakes in the faith.
Right. And you know what? It is interesting because there is a sense in which Jesus is a military commander with an army.
Yes.
All you have to do is read the book of Revelation, and we see on his
Yes.
second coming that is fulfilled.
Or even his war on the demons now, you know.
Yes, exactly.
It can be translated into a spiritual sort of power. You know, I should also mention that Gavin raised this objection about, oh, well, think about like, you know, the Ark of the Covenant typology, right? So whenever somebody touches Mary, it means that they have to die too. And it's like, well, it's, you know, and he tries to parody my position as, oh, well, since it's in the type, it has to be the anti-type. And I mean, I don't know if I've ever made an argument that relies upon that logic, but I just thought I'll kind of include that it's, you know, think about this, Dustin. I think the closest correspondent that we have to that typology or what happened, you know, was touching the Ark of the Covenant is Mary's perpetual virginity.
Mm-hmm.
No man could touch her. No man could, you know, treat her like any other woman. Right.
Exactly.
I mean, I think that's the closest. That's like the spiritualization of what was there in the Ark of the Covenant, where no ordinary man could touch and approach, you know, God's sacred vessel. And the same is true of Mary and her perpetual virginity of her sacred holy womb.
Yes.
Now, what does transfer over? Well, I think this is actually a fairly easy question to answer, because think about, for instance, if we have a typology here, much less if we have a textual allusion, then we should be able to discern to some extent, what did Matthew see in Eliakim that would be worth playing on in Peter? And in both contexts, receiving keys, binding and loosing, or opening and shutting, it's all about authority. That's the main thrust, that some type of unparalleled, unique authority is being given to this right-hand individual. And if we can't even say that, then the textual allusion and the typology becomes unintelligible.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have to say that. And I think that if one wants to argue that, oh, like maybe there is a textual illusion, but we can't know what's going on here, or they're going to say there's no textual illusion because we can't tell what's going on here, then we can call the bluff on that. Because so many scholars have pointed out, and I cited them left and right, like John T. Willis and others, that it's and Oscar Kuhlmann, the Lutheran scholar in the 20th century on Peter, that like we know basically the idea is that the Lord in the Old Testament gives a man incredible authority over his kingdom. The Lord in the New Testament does the same thing. I mean, this is so intuitive when you look at the passages side by side that I can't imagine that we can't tell what transfers over. You know, I'll say this too. You know, I think it's let me make sure that I get the scholar's name right. In his book Joshua Typology, I think it's Richard Onsworth. Although let me check to make sure I got the name right. Yes, Richard Onsworth in his book Joshua Typology, the New Testament, published by Morse Seebeck, he points out that the whole point of typology is to reveal the nature of things, right? In God's divine providential plan to bring out, you know, their historical literal reality. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, you know, for example, with the new Moses typology, it reveals something to us about Christ by seeing how Moses, you know, prefigures Christ, right? We see something about the nature of Christ. And so if that's the case, then it shows us something here if there's a valid typology on the nature of Peter.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, when you look at Isaiah 22, Eliakim is likened to a peg that is securely fastened, and we have Peter, who is the rock. So we have that stability imagery there. That's interesting as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So 3844. Any closing comments? So why should somebody become Catholic over, say, Eastern Orthodox? Why is Catholicism the fullness in this sense when we're talking about this topic, and that the other communion or other communions might lack?
At the end of the day, our fundamental desire as Christians is to obey Christ and to desire him fully, right? And if Christ, in pointing out this Peter Eliakim typology, is showing us something about the nature of Peter, the nature of the authority bestowed onto him, that is, by the way, intrinsically or by its nature successional, to be handed on. An office that was there to protect, to be a father, to be of use whenever the kingdom needed it. And then we see that in the New Testament, Peter is this kind of elder brother who sometimes, you know, Peter's kind of in the background. Other times Peter asserts himself, right, to protect the church. In Luke 22:31, he's the one to whom all the other apostles are entrusted as an elder brother. And so I think that we see here in the image of Eliakim and the image of Peter, someone who is there to be a caretaker for all. And if we're going to think about what Christ instituted, right, we know that the apostles are the guardians of the apostolic deposit of the faith.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, I think Pope Leo mentions this. Who's the shepherd of the shepherds?
Yeah.
Who's the guardian of the guardians, right? And I would say, who else would it be but the vicar of Christ? Who else would it be but the new Eliakim, who is that prime minister, second in command to the king? I mean, and if this is what the Lord says in the scriptures, then who are we to disagree with it? Who are we to question it? Because this type of authority that's given to Peter, this is not the authority of someone who's merely first among equals. This is the authority of someone who really was chief steward, father of the inhabitants of the New Jerusalem and the New Israel.
Amen. An authority with teeth, not merely honorific.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Suan, I've greatly enjoyed our time, and it's flown by. I know you have to get to another show with William Albrecht, so guys, make sure you check that out. So yeah, you've been viewing and listening to and or watching Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick. This was episode 75, Eliakim, Peter, and the Papacy with Suan Sonna. Make sure you check out his channel, Intellectual Conservatism, where you can view the full 4-hour exposition on this topic. It's been a great pleasure having you on. Again, my brother, I wish you all the best in your future endeavors. God bless, and I will end the broadcast in 3, 2, 1.